central decision-making portion of whether you decide to do it a virtual or an in-person or even a hybrid of those kinds of things. If you're doing multiple forms and it's a brand new exam and you say need to produce 250 items, coming up with that kind of number and finding people who are available for a week or more to develop those items if you do an in-person workshop can be a challenge, whereas doing a smaller number of items or fewer forms can also kind of change that decision making. Another thing to think about is the cognitive complexity of the items that you're going to write. If you're writing many items that are going to be kind of at that remember level, this is maybe an entry-level exam where you want to make sure the candidates have some basic knowledge. You're going to have that kind of lower cognitive complexity level. Whereas maybe if you're doing an expert level exam and you want them to do some troubleshooting, some analysis, some evaluation, and determining solutions, those kind of items tend to be a little bit more difficult to write that are on that higher cognitive complexity. So you might want to consider what does your exam itself look like? What does that blueprint tell you that you're going to have? You're going to have lots of those higher cognitive complexity level items, those analyze and evaluate kind of items, or you're going to have more of those remember level items. Remember level items tend to be a bit easier for item writers to produce. So that might be something that will be a consideration when you're determining how you want to support them and whether a virtual setting where there's a little bit less hands-on support, where that might be a little bit more helpful. So really thinking about that big picture, what is it that you are focused on completing, and how can you make that happen, whether you decide the virtual or in person. Typically, virtual tends to take a little bit longer, especially if you have unpaid volunteers, because it's difficult to determine whether you have that expert engaged because you're not sitting in a room with them. So if you have a time limitation, that's something you need to think about, or a high quantity of items. Those tend to be a little bit more difficult if you're trying to do that solely in the virtual environment, because you have a little bit less control over when people make things happen, how it fits into their day and things like that. Because again, you're going to rely on them to be doing it in their outside time. They're going to be doing it in kind of volunteer or outside hours. So that's when you think about the bigger part of the program. That's the things you want to consider. When we get into budget, budget's always a consideration for every program. How are you going to? What's your idea? If you have a small budget, then maybe looking at a solely virtual project might be the best way to meet your budget needs. Because the things you want to think about is, are you going to fly people in, so you're going to have to travel, take people into travel? Are you going to have accommodations and meeting space? So those things are all really important to think about if you're thinking about doing it in person versus virtually. You're going to have them doing these things at their homes or offices, and you'll just have to consider things like how accessible is the technology that you're going to be using for your SMEs. The other thing is, if you're asking your experts to use specific textbooks or facilities that maybe they don't have personally, in your budget, if you're going to do it all virtually, are you going to ship them materials that you want them to use to write items? Are you going to somehow provide that? And so that could be a budgetary consideration when you're thinking about doing a virtual only item development. And this is where maybe that kind of hybrid approach where you do some virtual and some in person might be a way of kind of accomplishing meeting both sides of the coin. And that really brings us into the tools component of this. So when you think about the tools that you'll need to use as you begin to go through the process, you're going to need some kind of item banking system. How are you going to hold on to the items? How are you going to keep them secure and safe? So having an online item banking system is always something to consider. If you don't have one already, this is something to look into. And as you're looking at those kinds of systems, you really want to think about how you're going to, what kind of workflow you're going to use. You know, some programs will have item writers writing independently. Then they'll have someone, you know, like me, as from, you know, a consultant's perspective, come in and review the items to make sure they meet the psychometric guidelines. And then after I've reviewed them, they're going to go to some kind of editing or branding review. And then they're going to go through the congruence and accuracy review with a group. And so you want to think about kind of that workflow. How are you going to write, review, and get ready to pre-test these items? And whatever expectations that you have, you want to make sure that you can communicate those accurately and efficiently with whatever item banking tool that you're going to use to make sure that they can meet your needs. You also want to, in that whole process, be thinking about security. And security for me is essential throughout the whole process of item writing, because your item content, your test content is your most valuable commodity. And you want to make sure that you have control over who can access the items, when they can access them, so that you have the ability to turn off and on access. For example, if you have a group of SMEs meeting together virtually to review items to make sure that they meet congruence and accuracy standards. You want to make sure that once they're done reviewing those items, they no longer have access to them. You want to make sure that they're working in a secure environment. If you choose to do this virtually, you're trusting that your experts are going to access these items in an area where it's secure, that they're not sitting in a Starbucks, for example, and writing items where anybody can see what items that they're writing, that they're using kind of common sense about security and your content, because, again, your content is extraordinarily valuable. And you want to be able to protect that to the best method that you have. So you may be, consider how that item banking tool is going to kind of fit in and kind of help you meet your expectations of, workflow and knowing who can have access to which items at which time. Your editing and branding review, what internally does your organization need in terms of branding in order to make sure that you have met branding standards, and when does that review need to take place? And then ultimately, how can you keep that secure? How can you keep your content secure so that your items aren't going to be exposed? We also want to think about, another bullet might be in there is how are you going to get those items into the testing system itself? How are you going to deliver the items? How well does this online banking tool work within your bigger picture of delivering those items to your candidates? So all those kind of things can kind of play a role when using an online item banking system within a solely virtual or a virtual hybrid system. Your online item banking tool is like the cornerstone for where your item writers access. Most online item banking tools will offer 24-hour access, so your experts can be writing and reviewing items any time of the day or night, which can be really helpful if you're working with multiple time zones and things like that. It gives everybody access when it is convenient for them. So thinking about those components when you're making your decision about tools is really important to make to consider all of those different aspects as you're getting through that. Next, you want to kind of consider the resources. What kind of training are you going to have for your SMEs, and what kind of text or training manuals do you provide for your experts as they're working through writing? Many of the associations that I've worked with who have virtual item writing or do a virtual in-person hybrid for item development will often, provide related textbooks or related manuals, things that they would like the experts to use, but provide them as like volunteer gifts if they're using volunteers for item writing or item development. But, other than that, what other kinds of support are you going to provide for the SMEs? Some organizations who are doing virtual only will provide a video recorded presentation of the item writing concepts, so that as new item writers join the item writing pool, that they have kind of a constant reminder on what are the standards for excellent items, what are the psychometric standards that you're using when you're developing items. So, what kind of training are you going to provide for those SMEs? How are they going to be able to access that training? And what kind of resources and materials do you think they're going to need to be successful? And this is especially important if you are allowing them to do this solely on their own. So they're doing a virtual experience for item writing. How are you going to keep them kind of, connected to the material that you're asking them to write items about? It's also, an opportunity for item writers who are experienced to maybe take part in this kind of training for the SMEs or mentoring the SMEs. Newer item writers, seeing a lot of organizations who have kind of hybrid approaches will have a coordinator approach, or they'll have a mentor SME approach where there's someone who has been item writing for a while and you've seen success in their item writing capabilities. They'll recruit those people to act as kind of a mentor or a coordinator for the group as a whole. And this person kind of provides support, helps the other SMEs identify areas that might, areas and items that might propose challenges that they have a STEM that seems to have some faults to it. They kind of help recognize and are maybe gentle encouragement when you're seeing SMEs who aren't performing, meaning not producing items. So having that that kind of mentor or kind of coordinator within the SMEs is often a very helpful aspect. And then item development done, if you do this solely as a group, you're training and you're doing all in person. Your training is right there in person for all the SMEs. They have that support. And then the text and training manuals, you can provide everything that they need right there in that spot. So item development in person might be a little more hands-on, and it's usually a little bit quicker if you're needing to meet a deadline at a faster pace. And then we want to talk about those subject matter experts, and this is, very important and key in selecting these people for either in person or virtual. You guys, I'm sure, are well aware of how important it is to have the right people in place at the right time. Some organizations are going to use volunteers, and so it's going to be a solely volunteer basis. And so how do you select those people? How do you recruit those people? Those organizations who are using employees who they have access to. Again, you're still wanting to pick the right people and to get buy-in, because knowing that they're going to, if you have an employee who's working they're going to have to set other things to the side to meet these deadlines. And how can you ensure that they are bought into the program? How can you ensure that they have the time available and the right people for the environment, for the exam that you're creating? So they have the right experience, the right expertise, and the right kind of buy-in for your exam. So whether you're using volunteers or employees, you really have to think about how you're going to recruit them, and then who's going to be in charge of that recruitment. I know a lot of organizations really struggle with finding the right people and getting their ability, getting them to commit. So, who's going to be in charge of that? What does that recruitment process look like? And then how are you going to identify quality subject matter experts? And then how are you going to support them and retain them? Are you going to provide, for retention, are you going to provide some kind of gift or some kind of stipend? Even organizations who use employees oftentimes will have, swag there for those people who participated, who have taken time out of their work schedules to participate in virtually or in person. I've also seen some great examples of virtual item writing where it's kind of a very interesting hybrid, virtual and in person, where everyone is on a webcam. So you work for a whole entire day, 8-hour day, but everybody in the room is all there via webcam. So it's much harder when everybody's on camera for people to kind of dip out and complete other work and not complete the deadlines and the item writing goals that you have when they're, kind of all there virtually but visually in the room together. So I thought that was a very interesting component, that they had kind of upped the level of responsibility and accountability within that virtual environment by asking everyone to be on the webcam. But also, if you're not requiring that, how are you going to support those people who choose to participate in the item writing, who knowingly are missing other components of their workday that they need to, make up for either before or after the development process has completed, whether it's a 1-week item writing workshop or it's a several-day item writing workshop? How are you going to support those people who are taking time away from their everyday work? And if you're going to do a virtual, are you going to, what are you going to provide for them? How are you going to encourage them to meet deadlines when they have basically their own schedules that they're working around, and people are working in days and some people are working in evenings or on weekends? How do you support those people, and what works well? Some organizations are really work hard having, that kind of mentors me in that position to kind of be the one nagging, if you want to say nagging, but kind of encouraging the group to meet goals and deadlines. And then, using some kind of in-person meeting as part of the reward for putting in all those volunteer hours before. So they'll oftentimes, I've seen organizations who do almost all of the writing itself virtually. So they'll have a 1-day training seminar, and they'll have everyone come to the webinar to train, and then they'll kind of set them loose over the course of several months to write the items necessary. And that mentor SME is out there helping them and supporting them and watching to make sure that they're kind of producing the numbers that they're being asked to produce. And then they meet after, the 2 months have gone by, then they meet in person, and they have a big in-person meeting to do all of the item reviews, so all the congruence and accuracy review in an in-person meeting. So they've taken care of all the development before. Now they're at the in-person meeting. They're finalizing all of those items, so those items are ready then for that pre-test phase. So that's kind of one way of making sure that you kind of have a little bit of both worlds. You're giving them that freedom, that volunteer time, and then you're having them come together. And then typically on those weekends where they're doing the CNA review, they'll have a really nice reception or something to kind of celebrate the hard work that the volunteers have put in up until that point. And that seems to be, seems to kind of resonate with that community. Some other communities offer certificates or some kind of acknowledgement of their participation. So that might be something that will help with that retention. But you definitely want to think about how are you going to retain those volunteers, and especially the ones that are of high quality, that you want to be able to keep using over and over throughout the process. So those are the things, and again, these, when you're considering whether you want to do a virtual versus an in-person, it depends on your goals, it depends upon your timeline. All of those things really play into making that final decision. So I wanted to leave some time now to let everyone ask some questions. I know there were some questions that were coming in ahead of time, and hopefully I've covered most of those from people who asked questions before the session started, but if I haven't, please feel free to jump in and ask some questions.
Okay, Sarah, it looks like we have a question here, and I'm just reading here the raw question. So what is a reasonable number of items to expect from someone per day or per hour in a live or in-person session, in a remote session, or offline on their own session?
That is a great question. Typically, we see about an item writer can average about 1.5 items an hour. So if you think about your time, if you're doing an in-person session, you can take the number of people you have writing, and it's about 1.5 items per hour is what they average. So that's a pretty standard. Again, you do have to take a little bit of consideration if you're asking them to write a lot of those analyze and evaluate items on that higher cognitive complexity level. That can slow them down, and so you can get closer to just 1 item an hour. But on average, it's about 1.5 items per hour that they can write. When you're talking about remote, I think it's very important to have specific deadlines for your item writers and to assign smaller assignments with shorter deadlines. So a 10-item assignment that you're asking them to complete in 2 weeks. That way, if they go in and they work on it, they can get several items done in a day, and then they can take a day or two away when other parts of their life kind of interrupt their ability to write items for you. But to be really, really conscious of a deadline so that you don't, because no matter what you do, no matter how good you are, you're going to have those experts who, wait until that last day to submit or to start writing their items. So, and when you're considering deadlines, make sure that they are provided 2 weekends. That's what we've found has been the best for fully remote item writing. Make sure that if you assign the assignment on a Wednesday, that you give them 2 full weekends before the assignment is due, because that's when we see most of the items being written on Sundays or Saturday evenings, things like that. I think I got that whole question.
Okay, it looks like we have another question, Sarah. And this question is, how do you handle virtual item writers who don't seem able to write good items, especially if they are paid?
That is extraordinarily difficult. I think that is where having that mentor item writer really, really helps to, have a good training system. So have someone there that can provide training or real specific guidelines that you want them to follow. And then having that person who's not necessarily part of the sponsoring organization, having that subject matter expert who is also a volunteer or another employee, but that's not part of the bigger organization. It seems like those people end up are able to approach those experts and help them kind of guide them. In an in-person setting, that's where my role as your facilitator would really come into play. I would really be working with these people to provide them advice, really encourage, show them or rewrite. I wouldn't, if it were me, I would really, force items back into their hands and help them to identify where things aren't going well. The other thing that really helps item writers is that review process. So going through one of the congruence and accuracy reviews and watching people pick apart those items. Watching that process often will help your item writers become stronger item writers. So using that congruence and accuracy process is like another level of training, because if they can pick apart an item and, oh, look, there's a negative stem and we don't want to use any negative stems, or there's an unfocused stem and how can we change that to meet the objective in the blueprint. When they're able to do that, they become stronger item writers. So I would really encourage, get them engaged in the congruence and accuracy process. Encourage a mentor SME to kind of take them under their wing. Those kinds of things would be the strategies I would use.
Thank you, Sarah. Looks like the next question here is for any objective. There are only so many questions that can be written. How would you recommend splitting up the assignments so you are not getting duplicate questions?
That kind of question comes up a lot. The experts always think that they're going to write the same question as somebody else. And I really found that it is not super common. It's not as common as you might think it would be. People have different approaches to the same kinds of concepts. So one way to be watchful of that would be to make sure that you're not assigning the one item writer all of those items, that you break up and you're asking each item writer to only maybe write 2 or 3 of any given item section. That will help kind of get a variety, because you'll have different people's perspectives on the same objective. Some people might key in on one concept where other people did not. Some people just don't think of the same obvious things that other people do. So that will help. And then, if you're creating multiple forms of a particular exam, and you know that you're having some of that overlap, it's really just important to kind of maybe identify those ahead of time so that you don't end up having those ones that are duplicates, say, ending up on the same form. So breaking it up and then identifying those that are too close to being the same.
Next question. Does the item writing workflow differ between live workshops versus remote workshops?
It doesn't. I would say it differs more between organization and organization rather than between remote versus in person. Most of our clients use kind of a very similar process with just minor tweaks in between, where you have an item writing stage, and then you have some kind of intermediate review, whether it is a mentor SME reviewing the items before they're pushed forward, or someone like myself as your facilitator reviewing the items before they get pushed forward, and then a first round of editing, and then a group review for that congruence and accuracy, and then a final double check of editing and a check of branding if you have those kinds of concerns, and then into that pre-test channel. Most organizations use some variation of that, and I don't see much variation between remote versus in person.
Looks like we've got a couple of more questions here, Sarah. How common is it for people to pay item writers, particularly those who write virtually?
I think it really depends upon the budgeting of the organization. I've seen organizations that pay their virtual item writers, and and we've worked with a lot of clients who their virtual item writers are employees. So by the sheer fact that they're doing this during their workday, they're getting paid, but they're not being additionally compensated. So I think it really and truly depends upon what your organization's kind of philosophy and opinion is on those kinds of things. I think some of the bigger organizations who don't pay are providing some kind of compensation via travel. They will not pay their item writers to write, to volunteer during the course of item writing. However, they have a congruence and accuracy review that's live, and they pay for their travel, and they pay for reception, and they pay for dinners and things like that. So I think that there's where your budgeting comes into play. How much are you offering to pay them to write items, and then would it be financially the same to have them all travel to a location? You know, taking into those kinds of considerations. What are you offering them? What are you getting from it?
Oh, another question, Sarah, from Matt. Have you seen much use of assessments, test especially, following item writing training?
Oh, like doing, I'm guessing like a kind of a Quizlet or some kind of assessment on whether or not the item writers paid attention to the training. I think, honestly, that's kind of the proof is in the pudding a little bit. If they paid attention to training, there are typically going to be better item writers, but you'll start seeing them produce. Whereas if they were not good, they didn't pay attention to the training, you'll have less, you know, less production. I think the real telling sign is when they get in there and start item writing and doing that review process, that CNA process to kind of cement into their brain the concepts that are important. Those things going together really make the item writer. I don't see a lot of quizzes, but that's not to say it wouldn't work. I just haven't seen a lot of it done. I see most of it done after they, you know, the evaluation of the quality of items kind of tells you a little bit more about that person.
Alrighty, and great. Thank you for answering that question, Sarah. And it looks like we have here another question. What test security measures do you have in place for virtual item writing?
That really depends on the item banking tool that you're using. Typically, your item banking tool is going to offer you the ability to customize accounts. So each item writer would have their own account, their own access, their own password, and that account can be enabled or disabled at will of whoever is your, you know, organization's contact person. That person would have control over that. And I think knowing who has access is probably your most important part. You know, how much access are you going to give them? So what are you going to show them, and for what part of the time? How long are you going to give them access? You know, once they've written their items, do they need to have access to that item bank anymore? And while they're writing items, do they need to see the whole item bank, or do they only need to see the items that they've written? So having the ability to kind of customize those permissions, I think that's a really important for organizations when they're thinking about how are you going to control, you know, who has access and when and to what. So using that tool is going to be your best, you know, defense in keeping your items secure.
This is another question, Sarah. How can you tell if this SME that you're recruiting is likely to be a good item writer? Qualifications, education, etc.?
That's a tough one. We actually currently within Alpine has a psychometrician and a couple of other test development professionals like myself that are doing some research on, you know, how do you identify an item writer, and how do you identify if an item writer is going to be a high quality item writer? And don't have enough data yet to really share, you know, anything profound yet with that. But I think, Donna, that would be a great if you wanted to ask Christina or Laura in the future.
Yeah, what I was
going to do another one of these. They have.
Yeah, we have a great webinar that we put up last fall that would be a great resource.
They did one, yeah?
Yeah, they did. Both Christina and Laura just did a great webinar that would be an incredible resource that I will refer the question asker to after the call. But we do have a great webinar that we already produced that really addresses how to identify SMEs that are right for your program.
And I think from a very preferable standpoint, from just my observational standpoint, engagement is probably the best indicator that I have seen. Is, does the expert want to be there? Do they have some kind of mental, professional attachment to what you're doing? And do they have that same kind of like passion for this exam and the importance of having this exam as you do by producing the exam? When you find those people who have that enthusiasm, those people are typically very good item writers because they're interested in the process. They are they've already got the buy-in. The other group of people that I've seen that can be really interesting item writers, but a little bit more risky, is people who are questioning the process. Those people oftentimes, when they find out how much work goes into writing items and how much review, they actually, kind of buy into it and become really strong advocates because they had their doubts and it kind of converted them. That those people are also really interesting, but they can be risky because they can be not excited about the process, and that can impact other people who are working through the process as well. So things to consider. But again, Yana will provide that link. There's some new research that they're working on. So.
We've got another question, and the person says, not sure if this was already covered, but how do your clients provide all the virtual item writers, SMEs, access to the text published sources, references on which to base the items? And if I need
that is absolutely a challenge. That is a great question. I would say there's several different ways that I've seen. If you are doing in-person item writing, I've seen organizations that absolutely ship all of the materials, all the textbooks, everything to their meeting location and set up a library. So there's access to all of the experts to all the materials that they would like to use. And those library books can be checked out and taken home with them if they're going to be writing items at home and they think a particular resource would be helpful. So I've seen that. I've seen other organizations actually create digital drop boxes that contain digital copies of the resources that they're looking for. And if you're doing a lot of virtual stuff and you're worried about shipping costs and things and you're shipping textbooks, having that kind of access can be very helpful. And other organizations actually will buy text and send it to their SMEs as thank you gifts, so that they are kind of building their SMEs library of resources every year by providing those materials for them. So kind of a variety of different options for you.
Sarah, we have a couple of more questions in the hopper. And it looks like someone's asking, are there specific distance item authoring tools that you might be able to suggest?
Well, I've used several. There's one, Zoomorphics has a tool out there that I would use regularly. Medicat has one called Itemmetrics that we use regularly. Both of those offer, a database kind of system that will allow your item writers, access to only particular things. It also allows you as the organizer rights to everything so that you can sort and organize and watch the growth of your bank. But there's lots of other tools out there. Exam Studio is the Zoomorphics tool. I'm trying to think offhand. Those are the two that I use most commonly, is Itemmetrics from Medicat and Exam Studio through Zoomorphics. But I know there's a few other ones out there. Web Assessor is another one. Maybe not as user-friendly as the other two, but depending upon your needs, it might be just fine. But those I would say are the big ones that I've used that are pretty user-friendly, and I haven't seen my experts have any difficulty, because that's another thing, is if you're working with subject matter experts who are not technologically very savvy, you need to make sure the tool is extraordinarily easy, right? Because you don't want them becoming frustrated with the tool and therefore not writing items because they can't use the tool easily. And all those companies, I'm sure, will have demo sites that they can provide for you to look at and ask a ton of questions. That would be my advice.
Alrighty. It says, do you ever have non-SMEs write items and SMEs validate them?
I really don't. I really see, you really want your, the right people writing items. I guess I would say, what is qualifying that person not to be a subject matter expert? If they know enough to write the items, then it seems like they might be a subject matter expert. So that would be my question. I would be curious as to what qualifies them to make them not a subject matter expert. So if it's someone internally writing items, that would go to questions about whether you're looking for accreditation, and if you are, how does that, having someone internally write the items, how does that play into the accreditation process, and those kinds of things. But
it looks like, sorry to interrupt, Sarah, it looks like he's clarifying. It says if they are an expert on item writing but not the subject matter.
Well, from my perspective, I'm an expert on item writing. I know the rules really well. I can identify, but I don't have the content knowledge, so I wouldn't be able to effectively write items. So I think it takes a really good combination of both, knowing the item, knowing the items, and knowing how to write items, and knowing the content. So I don't know. I think it would be really specifically related to that particular person's skills and abilities. I know I couldn't write an item for an IT company. I don't have that expertise, even though I know how to write items really well. It would need to be something that it was in my wheelhouse as well.
And to tack on to that, he says, with a design that's specific enough, do you believe it's possible?
I don't know. I don't know. It would really depend. That's our favorite psychometric statement, right? If you know any psychometricians, their favorite statement is "it depends." So I'm gonna fall back on "it depends."
Do your clients provide a status to the SMEs on how many of their items are approved through to the pre-test phase?
We really don't provide that. But I think that it's really important for whoever's your coordinator, like your internal coordinator, to identify that information, whether they provide it to the person individually or not. I don't know if that's necessarily important, but I think it's important for you, whoever's in charge of recruitment or retention of SMEs, to kind of identify this person wrote 40 items, but only 10 of those items went through and made it through pre-test and are going to be on a form. Whereas this person wrote 10 and all 10 of them were approved. So what can you do to support that person who wrote 10 and maybe get them to write 15? And then how do you mitigate that, that one person wrote 40 but only 10 of them were good? I think that really falls within, it's really important for your coordinator internally, your SME coordinator, to identify those things. If you want to ask those people who are great, you want to ask them back. And those people are not so great, you maybe want to not ask them back. You want to kind of hone in on the people who are great. But you also need to be careful that you don't burn people out. So how do you, mix new people in while supporting your great item writers, those kinds of things.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah, for answering all of those questions. It looks like the question queue is empty. As we are outroing, if there are any last-minute questions, feel free to queue those up. But I just wanted to say thank you again, Sarah, for sharing this information with us today. it was really, really valuable, I believe. And just to our participants, just so you know, we're going to be following up shortly with a download link to today's full presentation. And I'm also going to include a link to that presentation I mentioned earlier that really helps you get to the heart of choosing great SMEs that we produced last fall. If you haven't already, please do try to find us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. We'd love to engage you within those spaces as well. Thank you also again for joining us today on this leap year day. Make it count. You won't have another opportunity to rock this leap year for another 4 years. And with that, if you have any feedback or suggestions, please do email us at marketing@alpinetesting.com. We're always looking for feedback and ideas for great webinars. So with that, from all of us here at Alpine, have a great day. We appreciate your support and hope you enjoy the very rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.